CCDA is the Climate Change and Development in Africa Conference. It is a conference that is part of a program which is called Climate Change and Development in Africa, ClimDev Africa. This is an initiative of the African Union Commission, the African Development Bank, and the UN Economic Commission for Africa. It's an initiative which was mandated by the African Heads of State on Climate Change, CAWOSC, and authorized by the African Union itself. This is CCDA 11. It is actually different from the previous 10 CCDAs in the sense that it is being convened as a technical pre-workshop for the Africa Climate Summit. And the Africa Climate Summit is the first climate summit which brings together heads of state and government to develop an African position on climate change, a global position. And so the CCDA is actually organized in such a way that it is mirroring the themes of the climate summit. So all of the themes that we are discussing in CCDA are exactly the same themes as we have in the summit.
In my view, the COPs have created awareness and have profiled the challenge presented by climate change and associated challenges like air pollution, energy poverty, food poverty, particularly in Africa, where we have difficulties in implementing climate change solutions.
Policies are important in the sense that they provide guidelines as to where the continent wants to go. They set targets where we want to proceed to or towards as a continent. And for example, we have got the African Union Climate Change and Resilient Development Strategy. That strategy is actually setting the targets that the continent is supposed to move towards in terms of mitigation, in terms of adaptation, in terms of climate finance. All those are actually embraced. And if we have got such a continental policy, we then expect member states to domesticate it. In other words, they will now have to align their policies towards that continental one. And in a way, then there's kind of harmonization of policies across the continent.
It's important for us to know that finance alone is not a solution. Many countries are not absorbing the money they're given. It's for many reasons, but one of the reasons is also that you need technical capacity. You need the technologies, you need the right expertise, you need the infrastructure. So if you don't look at technologies, you don't look at technical experts, you don't look at the infrastructure, even if you have the finance, it will not help you. And that's why it's important that as we think about discussions on increasing climate finance to Africa, we should also look at building the scientific capacity and the technological capacity so that investment, for example, in the renewable energy, provide opportunities locally instead of, again, exporting jobs within the continent.
We don't need to turn a blind eye to Africa's resource endowments. We have sufficient resources, natural capital, minerals, water resources, sunlight, wind power, geothermal. All these resources can be commercialized to generate finance from within Africa to enable us to finance our climate change response actions in Africa.
Africa contributes very little to global emissions. Only about 3% of global emissions emanate from Africa. However, Africa also has the least capacity to adapt to the impacts of emissions that are happening from elsewhere, from outside of the continent.
We have a lot of countries with the capacity to absorb climate finance. However, the major challenge is actually to access that climate finance. There are only a few countries who have been successful in terms of unlocking climate finance. And the major challenge on the continent is actually the ability to mobilize climate finance. And I think that's where the problem is. But once the funds are there, it's actually easier for countries to spend such funds. However, there are also standards and procedures that are also there, which they should actually follow to be able to access finance or to be able to spend the money. And it's why you find that a lot of them are actually using third parties to be able to mobilize such funds. But otherwise, I think the critical issue is capacity building. That's what the continent needs.